Good afternoon. I have the pleasure, indeed the honor of introducing our speaker, Bettina Bergo. Yes, is it please talk once again? With the rolling R or this? No, okay, the flat American R, Bergo. Literally it's a Bergo. Sounds, anyway. It's a deep pleasure. The topic, as you see, is ambiguities and anxiety, history of a theme in 19th and 20th century philosophy and psychology. Bettina asked me if I have anything to say about the topic of anxiety. Beyond that, I learned a great deal from the paper that would be here, at least part of it. Bettina will trace the history of an idea in the anxiety, remarkably that has its origins, its initial anchorage in philosophy, particularly of Kant, and as she'll explore to us, it somehow, as it develops in the history of Western thought, it occupies a space, a dialectical space between the soma, the body, and the mind, between consciousness and physicality, if you wish. It's a very rich paper, but before that I just wanted to note that I had the opportunity to look at her CV. She's an extraordinarily seminal thinker, but not only seminal in terms of productivity, but intellectually versatile. And I'm sorry, personally, I've only met you in the corridors of the studies, of faculty of studies in the library, secret wing, so we at least somehow encounter one another. And I regret we haven't had the opportunity to really explore shared interests. She's even written on Buddhism, which is, as you know, plays a very special role in my own sensibilities. You've forgotten that you wrote the article.
It was a little while ago.
Yeah, a while ago. It's still a very fine article. Anyway, it's our pleasure to welcome Bettina, who has been serving as a visiting senior faculty member or scholar at the Marty Center. Bettina, please.
Comedic moment, it's a delight to see you. Perhaps I'll just have to go back to the beginning of this talk. Excellent. Here we go. Thank you so very much, Paul Mendes, for before I came here, I really rejoiced at the idea of having a chance to meet you. Truly did, and I hope we cross again in the paths of the carols. I want to thank, to begin with, the junior fellows, because given the originality of your research and the variety of your topics and the courage of subjecting yourselves to an overall critique, you taught me to write in a new way. So to begin with, the junior fellows of the Marty Center for the Advanced Study of Religion. To their mentors, Paul Mendes and Ryan Coyne, who's battling, I think, with the airport at this moment. To my fellow, Nancy Frankenberry, for the lunch in which she taught me a number of things, including her experience and insight. And above all, to the person who made this possible, schlepping keys across 12 states, finding me a place to live, Sarah Hammerschlag, scholar of Levinas, Derrida, and Blanchot. And so to the entire staff and membership of the Marty Center, and of course to Richard Rosengarten, Dean of the Divinities. I might do an Al Lingus and drop my pages since I have absolutely no space. Forgive me, I'm going to disrobe. I pray your forbearance because this is a little long. There's a lot to talk about when you talk about anxiety. So, to begin, the age of anxiety and the age of anxiety. In 1947, William H. Auden published his poem, The Age of Anxiety, written during the war in homage to William Butler Yeats. Sitting alone in a bar, 4 figures, minimally sketched yet somehow archetypal, reflect into the open. As the radio news grows darker, they are brought closer together as their laments weave into each other, all of them sinking into inebriation. The aging woman, Rosetta, muses, lies and lethargies police the world in its periods of peace. What pain taught is soon forgotten. We celebrate what ought to happen as though it were done. Are blinded by our boasts, then back they come, the fears we fear. We fall asleep only to meet the idiot children of our rebels and wrongs. Farouche they appear, reluctant look-behinds, loitering through the mooing gate, menacing or smiling. Nocturnal trivia, torts and dramas, wrecks, arrivals, rose bushes, armies, leopards and laughs, alarming growths of moles and monsters on memories stuffed with dead men's doodles, dossiers written in lost lingos, too long an account to take out in trade. No time either, since we wake up. We are warm, our active universe is young, yet we shiver. A half-century later, and as if heeding Auden's words of pain taught and soon forgotten, and the idiot the children of our rebels and wrongs, Jan Philipp Reemtsma of the Hamburg Institute for Social Research published his 2008 Trust and Violence essay on a modern relationship. Reemtsma argued there that together a mood uniting irony and anxiety might open a perspective through which we confront our contemporary socio-political situation. Is it not irony that affords us critical distance on ourselves? But what about the idiot children of the fears we fear? What is the point, in other words, of anxiety in Reemtsma's dialogue? Anxiety has no object, no purpose. The universe is young, yet we shiver. It is a sensation of trembling, and it turns into an emotion when it gains or seizes on an object. I propose to call anxiety an affect, because sensation and emotion affect us. Affects simply turn our attention to them, like Auden's reluctant look-behinds. But why study anxiety outside of psychology, pharmacology, or poetry? Reemtsma argued more prosaically that anxiety encapsulates our awareness, but of what? Of the contingency of our condition and hopefully our apprehensions about repeating the errors of the past. His suggestion to combine the moods of irony and anxiety comes as a thin prescription for living today, perhaps one last minima moralia. Yet if we grasp the perspective that irony affords, do we grasp anxiety in the fullness of its historical and philosophical context? For example, do we remember that anxiety is characterized by fundamental but opposed qualities, a stimulating and enlivening quality and a depleting, depressing one? When we confront what is possible or likely for tomorrow's society, anxiety still expresses our restless sense that either goes in search of action or sinks into an object as paralysis. How to live with this? I would say we must abide with it and then perhaps also attempt to think about it. The yes that greets Auden's diagnosis of the war and its New York aftermath is extended in Trust and Violence's recommendation of an anxiety maxim, conscious of the threat of repeating recent history. Reemtsma writes, perhaps against Kierkegaard and Heidegger's Angst, that our contemporary aversion to violence is fragile. It can be, perhaps will invariably be undone. And he adds, the coping strategies of the past, those unconscious attempts to preserve modernity by brightening its image, have failed. And the coping strategies of the present are all too transparent as a result. We know the risks and can't act as if we don't, for trust and irony don't mix. Of course, irony is a means of creating distance from self, and as such, an excellent strategy for overcoming angst. But while there's much to commend overcoming angst for the individual, there is little to commend it for modern society as a whole. The preservation of modernity, he writes, can take place only in angst, in the fraught awareness that the violent excesses of the past can recur and that our future is uncertain. Yet a society with nothing but angst would perish in a sea of despondency, overanalysis, and nihilism. To stave off despondency, Auden's final voice, intriguingly named malin, or clever, entreats that always opposite which is the whole subject of our not knowing, yet from no necessity condescended to exist and to suffer death. Readership speaks for his part of the protection of self-assurance. Self-assurance begins with detachment and so needs irony. Together, irony and angst might even transform knowledge. Readership adds tentatively, with luck, knowledge resurfaces as sensitivity. I would like in my study to turn to knowledge, taking the mood of angst as my object and to show if possible how thinking about anxiety in philosophy and psychology, Freud's notably, infuses the objectless trembling of anxiety with knowledge so that angst may turn into Readership's sensitivity. What then do we know of anxiety and its long history? Even if we don't consult the burgeoning popular psychological literature in which anxiety is a medicatable disorder, the origins of anxiety are as if overdetermined. We find anxiety discussed as early as the Roman Stoics in the form of an opposition. Angustia is counterposed to the greatness of heart Augustia cherished in statesmen and philosophers. Seneca held melancholy close to angustia, venturing, no animal is more fretful than man. Seneca the Younger wrote to Lucilius of the internal rot of first century Roman society. All men are led astray by delights that are deceptive and short-lived, like drunkenness, which pays for a single hour of hilarious madness by a sickness of many days. Or like applause and the popularity of enthusiastic approval, which are gained and atoned for at the cost of great mental anxiety. The aftermath, as we know, which is not so unlike Auden's malin and his entreaty of the always opposite, the aftermath was the growth of Christianity and the engulfment of Stoicism. But I don't propose to go back to the Romans and the statum tedium vitae that crept into the first centuries of the Common Era. What I'd like to do is trace the evolution of anxiety in select 19th and 20th century thought. I hope my study will appeal to philosophers, historians, cultural theorists. It is nevertheless a study in the history of philosophy and proceeds by significant philosophers and their discussions, sometimes their responses to each other, of anxiety as a mode of sensibility and an emotion. This duality, sensibility and emotion, is very important and sets anxiety as if between body and mind, corporeity and mental. Now, like Readership, I think we have yet to escape the age of anxiety. And the explosion of pharmacopoeia offering itself as remedy suggests as much. So it might be of value to know that the history or discussion of anxiety and angst carried on strongly over the past 200 years at least. My study grounds our understanding of anxiety's history and its importance in disciplines of the mind, notably in the following European philosophers and psychologists. You see the list: Kant, Hegel, Schelling, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Freud, Husserl, Heidegger, and Leibniz. I begin with Kant's transcendental innovation relative to empiricism and Leibnizian metaphysics. I show how Kant's critical revolution set a strong boundary between empirical thought and metaphysics. In their place, as we know, Kant set what he sometimes called a rational psychology, excluding all emotions except Achtung as attention and reverence, and all passions from the transcendental edifice. From this decisive Kantian moment, I examine Hegel and Schelling's responses, most notably to the father of transcendental ideas. My argument is as follows. While Kant provided empirical psychology with a powerful impetus by eliminating affects and passions from the critical project, and by insisting that only the laws of the flow of time or the inner sense should be examined by transcendental psychology, Hegel carried French revolutionary psychiatry back into metaphysics. If the soul was theoretically indemonstrable, as Kant argued, if the soul was an idea crucial to practical reason, but an idea all the same, then the soul returns in the mature Hegel, firstly as sentience or ability to feel. It does so because reason in Hegel is not something whose limits must be contrasted with the finite bounds of experience as in Kant. Hegel's reason is rather like a force in dynamic evolution. Hegel's careful reading of Philippe Pinel's medico-philosophical treatise on mental alienation or mania, 1801, provided Hegel with the empirical material essential to showing that reason survived and could grow, even in cases of its most patent absence. In his Berlin Philosophy of Mind, Hegel wrote, "The main point in derangement, madness, is the contradiction which a feeling with a fixed corporeal embodiment sets up against the whole mass of adjustments forming the concrete consciousness. The mind, which is in a condition of mere being, and where such being is not rendered fluid in consciousness, is diseased. The contents which are set free in this reversion to mere nature are the self-seeking affections of the heart, such as vanity, pride, and the rest of the passions. It is the evil genius in man which gains the upper hand in insanity, that in distinction from and contrast to the better and more intelligent part, and note, which is there also. The right psychical treatment therefore keeps in view the truth that insanity is not an abstract loss of reason, but only derangement, only a contradiction in a still subsisting reason." But how could Hegel be sure that Pinel, what Pinel called intermittent manias, preserved a reason tangled up in itself? Hegel was convinced by Pinel's moral treatment, which consisted in spending time with the interned, now freed of their shackles. Pinel urged that the healer of souls approach gently all the demands of their self-esteem and make no opposition to anything proposed that was judged doubtful or improbable, but always a tacit referral to later examination. Pinel followed this method, wrote on it repeatedly, and partly inspired Hegel to revisit the passions, reintegrating them into a project of an evolving reason in which they were indispensable. Anxiety was both emotion and passion. For Hegel and Pinel, anxiety was a clear sign of the contradiction between reason and derangement. In his 1809 departure from Fichte's identity philosophy, and his romantic turn toward a universal organicism, Schelling set anxiety this time as anxious longing or Sehnsucht at the origin of the universe, or God originating out of God's self. Schelling's theme of two originary principles existing without dialectical interaction, but utterly dependent on each other, gave rise to matter and form, matter and form. As matter and spirit, they gave rise to the balance manifest in animals and to their potential imbalance in humans. So we have here in humans evil and good. With Schelling, idealism began to think a living universe against Hegel's formal absolute, and Schelling developed an original conception of the positivity of human evil. The themes of theodicy, the separation of divine principles, and their ultimate reconciliation in the Ungrund, you see the brown, ran through all Schelling's subsequent investigations one way or another. When the elderly Schelling was brought to Berlin in 1841 to quell enthusiasm for Hegel's thought, Schelling taught his philosophy of revelation. In 1842, a 28-year-old Søren Kierkegaard attended Schelling's lectures for 4 months, from early November to February 3rd, 1843. At first, Schelling was delighted. Kierkegaard was delighted when Schelling uttered the word actual. Finally, idealism, or Schelling's Kabbalistically inflected idealism, had come to terms with actual existence. Kierkegaard rejoiced. "I'm so happy to have heard Schelling's second lecture. I have long groaned in travail. Then he spoke the word actuality about the relation of philosophy to actuality, and the unborn babe of thought leapt in me for joy as in Elizabeth. I remember almost every word he said from that moment on. But Kierkegaard was ultimately disappointed by Schelling and devoted his time in Berlin to the cloistered redaction of either or. Following his return to Denmark, he published The Concept of Anxiety, the first book to attach an ironic title to a serious existential study of anxiety. We are now in 1844, 1 year after Fear and Trembling, and the same year that Kierkegaard's philosophical fragments appeared. So from the first 4 chapters, Hegel and Pinel, Schelling and Kierkegaard, we learn that anxiety, taken in itself or in tandem with desire, as in Schelling and Kierkegaard, proves to be a sign of livingness or living possibility. In Schelling, it is what could only be called an affect, silently at work, affecting the absolute and propelling the emergence of the one of intelligibility and ultimately of all animal life. In Kierkegaard, Angst is the psychological mood indicative of our ability to do, itself indicative of freedom. Most important is that for the Danish philosopher, anxiety precedes freedom and understood as an uncaused act. But anxiety is no cause, it's our condition, the mark of the past and the sins of the fathers. For Kierkegaard, anxiety evolved individually and culturally. In something like a sketch of the spiritual evolution of the species, Kierkegaard argued that the more our self-awareness or spirit intensifies the consciousness that we are embodied life and psychic reflection, the more we feel anxiety about the past. As the root of a vital engagement with being, as energy, anxiety is appreciated. But as a vibratory enthusiasm lacking any clear object, the same affect exhausts us. One way or another, anxiety precedes and accompanies our free leap into sin or openness. In this way, Kierkegaard psychologized Schelling's still abstract conception of the 2 principles of the root of good and evil. As we'll see when Schopenhauer proposes his correction of the Kantian system. Angst is our lived experience of the action of the life will within us and in all living beings. So that is the end of one thread, at least as it began in the 18th century. At this point, the narrative thread moves in several directions, for good reason. As Kant's division, as you know, of reason into pure theoretical and pure practical, and his argument in the preface of the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, held that the idea, not the knowledge, but the idea of freedom was not in contradiction with theoretical knowledge. That is, it's enough that we believe we are free in order to discover freedom in doing our moral duty. Now, the young Schopenhauer, who studied Kant, Fichte, and Schelling assiduously from 1810 to 1812, charged that Kant's approach to reason had given rise to some of the strangest variations on idealism yet seen. From Fichte's absolute ego to Schelling's identity of difference to Jacobi and Böhme, then back to the later Schelling with the origin of God out of God's self, Schopenhauer wrote in his 1813 dissertation that if practical reason could justify beliefs like freedom, the existence of God and the soul, then this quote led crazy philosophers headed by Jacobi to that reason which directly comprehends the supersensible, and to the absurd statement that reason is a faculty intended essentially for things beyond all experience, and to the assertion that it recognizes directly and intuitively the ultimate grounds of things without even going into swift thought. Well, this was not one but several misunderstandings of Kant, and I can't get into Kant's reactions, by the way, to Fichte's 4th critique of revelation, because apoplexy is not anxiety and would be off topic. But I do quote the young Schopenhauer, because if the unfolding of late idealism in Schelling moved idealism into romanticism, or sometimes organicism, then the correction Schopenhauer proposed in his masterpiece, World as Will and Representation, fulfilled Jacobi's anxiety about atheism, and opened philosophy to the centrality of the body. Why the body in the wake of Kant's transcendental philosophy, which recurred to it so sparingly? Schopenhauer reminded his readers that Kant's critical project had clearly shown that what we finite beings know is representations, Vorstellungen. These constructions make experience possible thanks to the spontaneous schematization of intuition, as we know, and our innate categories of the understanding. But philosophies of pure representation, and by the way, they're still with us today, philosophies of pure representation entail contradictions, one of which is this. Even if the condition underlying the synthesis of experience, that is, even if the thing in itself had some ontological status, the thing in itself would remain representation. An undetermined, perhaps ungraspable representation, but a representation all the same. In other words, the world is all representation of Vorstellung, but for Schopenhauer, the world is as it is itself. Any search, then, for a ground of being proves a contradiction in terms, because the ground itself is a representation. Now, I take this moment with Schopenhauer because beyond Fichte and Schelling, Schopenhauer's thought influenced more than Nietzsche and Wagner and gave a very concrete thrust to post-metaphysical thinking. Rudiger Safransky calls this three affronts, which we readily recognize today. First, the cosmological affront. Our world is one of countless spheres in infinite space, with a moldy film of living and knowing beings existing on it. Must be my neighbors. Second, the biological affront. Man is an animal whose intelligence must compensate for a lack of instincts and for inadequate adaptation to the living world. Third, the psychological affront. Our conscious ego is not master in its own purpose. This was a death of God philosophy that required no madman to announce to his city that God is dead. The world for Schopenhauer is one of representation. But we have to take care to distinguish between representations of objects and representations of subjects. Since Berkeley, the maxim held sway that every object presupposes a subject cognizing. But what remained enigmatic was the subject in itself. Kant's first critique, Paralogisms on the Soul, had shown, and Schopenhauer accepted this, that we know ourselves experientially through representations. Indeed, in the paralogism of personality, we appear to ourselves as discrete snapshots, or little steel balls, each one striking the other and transmitting all its force and velocity to the subsequent ball. Why snapshots and balls? Because time was the form of inner intuition, not a reality outside of representation into which representations could all fit. There was therefore no objective unity to a subject, and the ideality of space and time in Kant led Schopenhauer to a disquieting conclusion. As the mere forms of space and time, of outer and inner intuition, not to mention the categories, as mere forms, space and time strike all phenomena with a real and moral non-existence, a moral nullity. The Kantian phenomena, or Erscheinung, thus boiled down to simple shine, mere appearance for Schopenhauer. With his commitment to probity, Schopenhauer forged what Alexis Filonenko, the French historian of idealism, called the founding moment of the transcendental category of tragedy. There is no meaning to living, and death is what it is, a nothing. Some commentators see in Schopenhauer, not Fichte, not Schelling, the culmination of the first wave of late Kantianism, before the rebirth of Kant's thought with Hermann Cohen and Paul Natok. But Schopenhauer ventured at this point a positive step that extracted him from the representations dilemma. A subject doesn't only have knowledge of itself as an object, he said. A subject also has an immediate knowledge of itself as a feeling. It experiences itself directly or even prior to syntheses of feeling into experience. Hence, the subject affects itself outside of time, understood again as the form of inner intuition. Moreover, there's no reason to suppose that only I or only humans self-affect in this way. It's quite legitimate to ask what it is that we're feeling when we self-affect. And Schopenhauer's response is we feel our living bodies, much the way any living being does, as sensation, striving, trembling, and with this pleasure and pain. Immediate self-affection, then, is the fact of being alive. And following the distinction of knowledge or experience into objective as representations and subjective as immediacy, we can say that when we experience being alive in terms of motives and causes, we have already objectified being alive thanks to the activities we undertake. But immediately, we experience being alive as activity in passivity. The objectified acts and motives would be the realization of what the tradition called the will. The subjective self-affection would be the shared presence of livingness in us, like a groundless thrust, or as Michel Henry, whose death to Schopenhauer is considerable, put it, the concept of life thus divides. For the first determination according to which life resides in the will to live and proposes itself as desire without end. To this first determination is added the essential determination, in conformity with which life now needs or points to the mode of this will's givenness to itself, a mode of givenness in which the will feels itself immediately, and which makes it not a simple or psychological will, but a living will. This will, closer to Spinoza's Conatus Ascendi, very good, Spinoza's Conatus Ascendi, closer to that than the will that Kant discovers its freedom by doing its duty. This will is the immanence of life in us. Through it, bodies take shape as the objectification of life in its many modes. And Schopenhauer added, we can turn the expression in different ways and say, my body and my will are one, or what, as representation of perception, I call my body, I call my will, insofar as I am conscious of it in an entirely different way comparable to no other. Or, my body is the objectivity of my will. Or, apart from the fact that my body is my representation, it's still my will and soul. In light of this, it would be theoretical egoism to suppose that only our individual bodies have immediate self-affection, and not similarly those of any living being. In contemporary terms, what the body becomes, a kind of symphony of eyes, mouth, limbs, sex, hands, teeth, is the gradual objectification and ordination of functions. There isn't first an I and then a function that conveniently moves into it. There's a living world with beings of different sorts, evolving, differentiating, and then the need or requirement to see or perceive in keeping with the environment. With this move, Schopenhauer argued that the world was representation and will. Indeed, his way past the conundrums that he and others pinpointed about representation was the activity of the will in its self-unfolding and differentiation. I'm interested in the striking way that Schopenhauer got past Kantianism toward a thinking of life based on his analysis of the principle of sufficient reason. I'm also interested in the way that the will, this groundless principle, is felt in us and by us even before it becomes experience. It is felt as restless striving, but for my purposes sets anxiety at the heart of post-Kantian philosophy. As Schopenhauer's thought is vaster than this sketch suggests, there's so much of Nietzsche and Bergson in him, and later on of vitalism like Ludwig Klages's. But there's also an Eastern ethic or way of caring for living, because the presence of the will or life in us can be exhausting. It can be a torment that will not be still, but we can quell this tiresome urging intellectually. Recall the story Schopenhauer relates of the Indian hero Arjuna. Reading the Bhagavad Gita, Schopenhauer sets Arjuna on the field of battle with Krishna behind him. Facing the imminence of massacre and imagining the thousands who will perish, Arjuna loses heart to Krishna and wants to give up the fight. But Krishna reminds him that finite intelligence fancies time as historic, one-directional, and unique. But that is not time. which is only the alteration of one thing standing in the same space, argues Schopenhauer. As such, only where there is representation is there time and space. If we ask what time is in itself, the answer could only be nothing. Or again, an extensionless present. Or again, an extensionless present, like a tangent floating atop a circle. When Arjuna realizes that what he sees is cloaked by the veil of Maya, he is freed from his overestimation of the principle of individuation and individual lives, and recognizes that life simply lives. Arjuna gives the sign for battle, the anxiety that is his will, that imminent trembling that turned into fear when it imagined slaughter, has been stilled. Here, then, we find the intellectual quieting of the will, a Spinozist and Eastern approach on Schopenhauer's part to anxiety. His philosophy offers understanding, not hope, and is light years from Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety. What's more, Schopenhauer's influence extended from Nietzsche to Tolstoy to Bergson and crossed into the 20th century, where it appears that the hesitating apology in Freud's Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Please note that for Schopenhauer, our access to the principle of life, which he called the noumenal will, was through sensation. As sensation, anxiety expresses well the urging of life in us, but it was an emotion that needed to be quelled intellectually, as we saw with Arjuna. Both emotion and sensation, bodily yet amenable to intellectual intervention, anxiety expressed self-affection in living organisms. But so far as it was an emotion, anxiety required an object, like battle, slaughter, to be intentionalized. Nevertheless, in the mid-19th century, the question of whether all humans experienced the same emotions was unsettled. To the polygeneticists, cultures varied widely, hierarchically, and if emotions and intellect had a dialectical relationship with the culture of given individuals, then the universality of emotion could hardly be sustained. Such a claim would have devastating consequences for philosophies attempting to unfold at the transcendental level. In the famous 1844 year of the concept of anxiety and the year when the second edition of World as Willing Representation came out, Charles Darwin was immersed in the preparation of a study of the emotions in man and domestic animals. It would take him 28 years to complete. The expression of the emotions in man and the animals was ultimately published in 1872, 1 year after the Descent of Man, and 1 year before Darwin published his final corrections to the 6th edition of Origin of Species. The timing was serendipitous and justifies my excursus on Darwin. Remember that the readers of Origin were many and influential. Marx and Engels read Origin, but didn't bother with the Descent of Man. Yet it was the Descent's paradoxical thesis that complicated the mechanism of selection operating under the struggle for survival. In other words, in 1871, Darwin would argue that natural selection operates at all levels in nature, assuring a Malthusian survival of the fittest, up to the point at which culture takes on a specificity of its own. Now, Patrick Thor, the French translator of Darwin and author of numerous books on him, discussed the implications of this. One implication is that cultural evolution, unlike merely natural evolution, proceeds thanks to, quote, the progressive installment of an anti-selected functioning in human social institutions. Or again, against the dying out and extinction of the weak, the ill, the indigent, are opposed individual or social behaviors of protection, assistance, help, and rehabilitation, which are indifferent to the idea of a decline in the quality of the hereditary legacy, which decline is inevitably connected to the reproduction of weaker beings. Indeed, Thor calls this Darwin's reversive effect, taking evolution in a direction that favored social and even moral complication, opening benefits that were no longer biological so much as cultural. This broke decisively with Herbert Spencer and Edward Tyler, for whom social life proceeds out of biological, but continually and without a reversive effect. I would contend that in publishing the expression of the emotions after the Descent of Man served Darwin a polemical purpose, in addition to arguing against polygeneticists and in favor of the fundamental unity of humanity. The polemical purpose was to counter the popular social Darwinism of the time, which held that too much altruism in a given society would promote degeneracy, and the degrees of civilization and types of humans varied according to the development or restriction of sentiments like sympathy. Darwin turned his attention to 5 emotions: fear, pleasure, suffering or grief, rage, and distress. For my purposes, fear and anxiety stand together. Darwin argued that the expression of emotions constituted a universal sign language that likely preceded the development of spoken language. Indeed, he pursued his thesis all the way to domesticated dogs and cats and old-world monkeys. However, expression didn't just function as an iconic sign. Citing the work of anatomist Louis-Pierre Gratiolet on physiognomy and the movements of expression, Darwin copied. It follows that the senses, the imagination, and thought itself, however elevated, however abstract, cannot be exercised without awakening a correlative sentiment, and that this sentiment is directly, sympathetically, symbolically, or metaphorically translated in all the spheres of the external organs as though each one of them had been directly affected. Gratiolet's claim was important because expression made possible the empirical study of emotion and sensibility, thanks notably to the extraordinary photographs of Duchenne de Boulogne and his hapless subject. If Gratiolet was right, and mental activities from imagining to logical reflection excited the nervous system, spontaneously eliciting correlative sentiments, then showing the legibility of expression, whatever the culture of the individual expressing, implied that the underlying affects and emotions should themselves be recognizable to anyone. This suggested, in addition to serving as iconic signs, that expressions of emotions gave us an entry point into human mental activity itself. Indeed, the universality of sensibility and emotion promised the investigator a glimpse into the origins of embodied communication and material in favor of a common ground for the human mind, perhaps even the mind of the domestic animal. But that's not all. In the Descent of Man, even as Darwin reversed the social Darwinist's continuous thesis, Darwin reminded his readers that our great philosopher, Herbert Spencer, has recently explained his view on the moral sense. Citing Spencer, Darwin copied, "I believe that the experiences of utility, organized and consolidated through all past generations of the human race, have been producing corresponding modifications, which by continued transmission and accumulation have become in us certain faculties of moral intuition, certain emotions responding to right and wrong conduct, which have no apparent basis in the individual experiences of utility." If you keep in mind what Patrick Taw called Darwin's reversive effect, you see that Darwin is concerned with expression in light of certain emotions responding to right and wrong conduct. In short, Darwin is interested in the relationship between human morality, or better, human sympathy and altruism, and the specific affects developed in function of utility, but not under conditions of selection of fittest. If he could show that the expressions of emotions translated the experience of emotions and states of mind, and if his 5 sets of expressions were recognizable by people regardless of culture, then Darwin would have shown that whatever the culture, the emergence of affects and behaviors, notably altruism and the protection of the weaker, had carried natural selection straight into social selection, as if turning the principle on its head for the survival of the collectivity. Would he not argue confidently in The Descent of Man that there is not the least inherent improbability in virtuous tendencies being more or less strongly inherited? Moreover, except for the transmission of moral tendencies, we can't understand the differences believed to exist in this respect between the various races of mankind. Why the except for here? The great difficulty that Darwin encountered over his decades-long correspondence with British Empire landholders and clergy in Asia, Malaysia, North America, and parts of Africa, the difficulty was transmission. If virtuous tendencies were more or less strongly inherited, then what was the means of their transmission? Here, Darwin required Lamarck in French adaptations. Darwin, after all, would not become Darwin until R.A. Fisher worked out population genetics in the 1920s. Somehow, habitual activity had to be transmissible. It had to become hereditary. If species varied according to climate, needs, and the frequent and sustained use of an organ, then use and practice gradually fortified the organ and gave it a power proportionate to the duration of its use. That's Lamarck. And he argued further that these powers would in turn be preserved through the generation of new individuals, provided the changes were common to both sexes. Now, because Darwin doubted there were leaps in evolution, and because habituation and transmission had to be the key to universal expression in body language, you find a lot of Lamarck in the Darwin of 1871 and 72. Although Lamarck was not an object of ridicule then, Darwin nonetheless rallied to his position. Firstly, Darwin argued that a man often wishes to make certain gestures conspicuous or demonstrative and will raise his extended arms with widely open fingers above his head to show astonishment, or lift his shoulders to his ears to show he cannot or will not do something. The tendency to such movements will be strengthened or increased by their being thus voluntarily and repeatedly performed, and the effects may be inherited. In both the expression of the emotions and the descent of man, the conclusion was unavoidable. The far greater number of the movements of expression, and all the more important ones, are, as we have seen, innate or inherited. Moreover, under conditions of social well-being, natural selection acts only tentatively. And we see clearly that sympathy becomes part of a social selection. Originally selected quite naturally, it is then passed on. Most importantly, for my purposes, Darwin's voluminous arguments led him to conclude with the following remark. I have endeavored to show in considerable detail that all the chief emotions, all the chief expressions exhibited by man are the same throughout the world. This fact is interesting, as it affords a new argument in favor of the several races being descended from a single parent stock, which must have been already almost completely human in structure and to a large extent in mind before the point at which the races diverged from each other. We know that this study, which does a lot more than argue for a secular monogenesis, met with the fierce opposition of cultural anthropology, notably that of Margaret Mead. But recent decades have seen its rehabilitation. For my purposes, the excursus on Darwin is necessary to address the question of the general legibility of expression and by extension, the universality of emotion. Before I could turn to Nietzsche's adaptation of Schopenhauer and Nietzsche's own reading of Herbert Spencer and the German Darwinist Wilhelm Rue, I had to address this debate. So without wanting to exhaust, I can venture a few words about Nietzsche. Unless you're all dying. Quick. The impact of Schopenhauer's descriptions of the will on Nietzsche is well known. Nietzsche breaks Schopenhauer's metaphysical will into competing forces and bodies. In this, Nietzsche follows Wilhelm Rue's radical Darwinism that explained the emergence of bodily organs through competition between cells and tissues. But struggle in Nietzsche opened onto a unique hermeneutics of forces, so that the weaker force somehow interpreted the stronger force and fell in with it, just as the stronger force understood in its way the weaker force. This isn't so improbable when you consider the activity of antibodies attacking cancer cells. But the implications for what we call reason and the good are far-reaching, because it is the living body, as so many hierarchies of forces, that firstly grasps what is good for its own growth. In 1885, Nietzsche wrote in his notes, man is a plurality of forces situated in a hierarchy in such a way that some command, but those commanding must also create for the ones that obey everything needed for their preservation in such a way that they are themselves conditioned by the existence of those they command. All these living beings must be of a similar kind, or else they could not serve and obey one another in this way. Rather than speaking of forces whose effects alone we perceive, Nietzsche would write of Wille zur Macht, will or wills toward power or stronger will. With Nietzsche, the body thus comes into a new conceptuality, that of becoming, in which the original morality concerns the good of the body as a dynamic composite organism. Before any notion of a faculty like the will, in opposition to anything transcendent like Schopenhauer's noumenal life principle, Nietzsche proposed a materialism that looked nothing like the materialist mechanism of his time, which itself worked with objective causality. Mechanism, Nietzsche argued, reasons badly. It takes effects for causes when the actual causes are self-regulating or cybernetic, to use contemporary parlance. The first great intelligence is the body, and Nietzsche uses the human analogy and proposes an interpretive intelligence whose processes unfold at all levels, including that of cells and tissues. Didier Franck puts it clearly. The relation between forces, constitutive of force itself, is not only quantitative, for in the absence of all definitive equilibrium, the quantitative relation between forces, which is that of a greater to a lesser or a lesser to the greater, becomes a qualitative relation between superior and inferior forces. Although this sounds like anthropomorphism, nothing could be farther from the truth, as Nietzsche's method depended on dehumanizing our conception of nature. By dehumanizing, Nietzsche didn't mean denaturing humans or committing some wrong against them. He meant taking our self-image out of our approach to natural things, including our bodies. As he recalled in 1885, in a note entitled The Inverted Order of Time, the outer world has an effect on us. The effect is telegraphed to the brain. There it is prepared, given form, and led back to its cause. The latter is then projected, and it is only then that the fact reaches consciousness. That is to say, the phenomenal world appears to us as a cause only after this cause has had an effect. Only after the effect has been elaborated. That is, we continually reverse the order of events. While I see, it already sees something else. Integral to his overarching project of favoring the revaluation of nihilistic values, the guiding thread was the body itself. The body should be understood not as a being, but processually, as the ongoing interaction of forces or wills or souls, and should try different terms. Each one was overladen with connotations. Be that as it may, these interactions proceeded according to a dynamic hermeneutics governed by intensities or quanta of force, Nietzsche's own word, where force means strength and health above all. It's for you. In 1887, he observed, in summa, that which becomes conscious is subject to causal relations that are entirely withheld from us. The sequence of thoughts, feelings, and ideas in consciousness expresses nothing to indicate that this sequence is a causal one. Apparently it's so, to the highest degree. On this appearance, we have founded our entire representation of spirit, logic, reason. None of these exist. They are fictitious syntheses and unities, and these have been projected into things and behind things. Put succinctly, Nietzsche's project amounted to overcoming nihilism inherited in Paul's interpretation of the life of Christ and the Pauline creation of an ecclesia of members, all of equal worth and dignity. But the body, wrote Paul, is not one member, but many. If the foot shall say, because I am not the hand, I am not of the body, is it therefore not of the body? In Paul's revaluation of Jewish law and his conception of a pneumatic body, justice among the believing equals is situated in the resurrection. If there be no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is also not resurrected. But if Christ is not resurrected, then our preaching is vain, and so is our faith, wrote Paul to the church in Corinth. Nietzsche, as son and grandson of Lutheran pastors, saw the new justice and a sure resurrection in eternal recurrence. He was anything but the first to observe the demise of the Christian God. Hegel had already done so in 1807. But Nietzsche added, and without aggrandizement, that now we have absolutely no further mastery over our heads. The old world of values was theological and has been overturned. More briefly, there is no superior instance over us. Insofar as God could be such an instance, we are now ourselves God. We must attribute to ourselves those attributes that we once attributed to God. Such a task was in itself enough to foster anxiety, but I don't think that was Nietzsche's goal. Well-known arguments from the genealogy of morals concerning European man with coat of tawny and ruined nerves point to the actual object of his revaluation. For Nietzsche, European us was the reality of life forces turned back against themselves and against our bodily health. So anxiety was one of the forms of his ressentiment. It was Max Scheler, one of Nietzsche's best readers, who brought this out in his 1912 On Resentment and Moral Value Judgment. Scheler's strategy expanded Nietzsche's meditation on the showing, the manifestation of resentment beyond the behaviors of Nietzsche's quasi-historical groups like the caste of priests in the genealogy. Attempting to provide a phenomenology of Nietzsche's evaluation of values, Max Scheler examined the specific affects through which ressentiment came into consciousness. Thus, fear, anxiety, and intimidation would be the psychical dynamite that engendered processes that Nietzsche had himself insufficiently described, though Scheler wrote, he certainly had them in mind. It's thanks to Scheler and his sustained reading of Nietzsche that we see how anxiety proves again to be a sensation and emotion that spans body and mind. Not Kierkegaard's sign of our freedom to do, much less the epiphenomenon of Schopenhauer's universal will. Anxiety allows Nietzsche to rethink the living body in history and philosophy as the source from which philosophy must unfold after the death of God. From his principle, the body philosophizes, the hegemony of reason and consciousness are set on their heads, and a hypostasized subjectivity deconstructed as we are invited to become what we are, creatively alive. So much for the 19th century. I had in mind to explain the chapters on Husserl, Heidegger, Freud, Levinas, but I'll just say a few words about Levinas and then conclude so our bodies can philosophize. I hope you can see the red thread, as well as the fractures in my tale, whether it accompanies the discovery of intermittent manias, which shows that reason in Hegel's sense subsists and survives in madness, whether it's tied to birth and desire, as in Sehnsucht, or whether it precedes the leap by which we discover that we do act freely if sinfully. Anxiety teaches us that there are passages between sensation and feelings and emotions and passions. This suggests that anxiety stands on the metaphoric razor's edge between body and mind. Moreover, it implies that psychophysical parallelism admits fleeting junctions, points of near encounter between bodies and minds. And if we follow Kierkegaard and Heidegger, anxiety proves to be curiously revelatory. We discover our freedom through an act. Well, Kant already knew this in terms of practical duty. But before there is an act, there's angst, Kierkegaard's trembling that knows even as it does not know. So how so knows what it doesn't know? Perhaps our morally first knowledge is of possibility. Indeed, as Freud would rethink it in 1920, anxiety was not so much a symptom of repression as it was the initial sensation of angere, or choking, which seized hold of the neonate even before the ego had developed. And anxiety returns whenever the ego is threatened. It returns as bodily and ultimately as an emotion open to intellectualization. As the privileged sign of livingness, with or without a life principle, anxiety urges in us, shows us we are alive, but may open to despair and exhaustion. It can perhaps be quieted, perhaps transvalued beyond our Western nihilism, as Nietzsche and Reimsma seem to hope. Finally, if we follow Darwin's investigations, we discover that expression can be studied, can be studied as a mirror of the mind, offering a privileged legibility of emotions. Could it be that anxiety belongs among those affects that over the course of repetition became habitual and ultimately like a second moral nature, the way sympathy had become? So this question brings me to my final remarks about Levinas. Why keep you from a glass of wine? Because Levinas offers something quite new on anxiety. Emmanuel Levinas is a unique heir to Husserl and Heidegger. Unlike Maurice Merleau-Ponty, their other heir, Levinas brought the justice teaching of biblical prophetism into phenomenology and hermeneutics. For philosophers, this is really a very strange thing to do, and you wonder why you should care. The answer might come from applying to ethics Adorno's remark about poetry after Auschwitz. What possible ethics could construct itself on consensus and rational principles alone after Auschwitz, Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and? If we take these events seriously, then we can neither say that it cannot happen in my backyard nor rest content with the moral intuitionists who predicate morality on an adequate education in ethical perception. You might also ask of neo-Kantians like Christine Korsgaard what it is that makes rationality so intrinsically normative. The later Levinas resituates the grounds of ethics on the basis of the, quote, other insane, on the basis of an alterity we find in us. This other that we do not recognize as of ourselves is an affect. It's anxiety as dynamic and intersubjective emotion, or still more intensely as pure passion. Not so different from Freud in this sense, Levinas argues that a subject emerges in ongoing tension with affects that overflow its reflective understanding. Levinas's 1974 concept, the other and the same, points to the buildup over time of embodied memories accruing to our intersubjective origins. This explicitly extends Husserl's work on passive synthesis now into affects set in an intersubjective context. In Levinas, anxiety, in addition to being the crossing point between bodily sensation and higher level emotions, anxiety emerges as the unstable movement between nonsense and sense, affects like obsession, and actions like offering words to another, like here I am. Now, the anxiety that points to our intersubjective responsibility toward another person argues for a new time structure as well, relative to Husserl's unified flow of time consciousness that created unity in all our mental acts. The anxiety called the other and the same has a time that cycles back and intensifies, because the other whose gaze and approach leave affective, mnemonic traces building up over the course of my conscious life. This other also contributes to my growing sense of uniqueness. In the moment of encounter, we alone are called to respond. And the other contributes to an incipient ethical responsibility toward that other person. Anxiety, which Levinas characterizes with strong terms like persecution, obsession, recurrence. Anxiety is the affective tone of our connection to other people who approach us. We can refuse to answer. We can respond with violence, and we sometimes do. But Levinas's point is that a deep inquiry into our emotional structures show the origin of responsibility for the other. These emotional structures are probably not, learned affects, and we don't bring them up by ourselves. They are the affects of our intersubjective interconnection, and they're the very reason why we are, at higher levels, even interested in ethical questions. So is there a lesson from this unwieldy study? If so, then it's situated at two levels, an intra-philosophic level and a psychological level. The philosophical level shows how difficult but important it is to integrate affects into inquiries, into the preeminence of reason. It pays attention to philosophies that discern in anxiety a sign of a precognitive, pre-reflective knowledge, whether of our possibilities, freedom, or Heidegger's question, why is there being and not simply nothing? The reason why psychoanalysis is philosophically indispensable to a history of anxiety lies in what psychoanalysis teaches us about an embodied subject. It teaches us that this compound sensation emotion may be the first that we experience, embodiment, before there is even a we or ego there to represent the experience of ourselves. Thus, at the psychological level, anxiety would be the fundamental affect, accompanying sensations of pleasure and displeasure. Moreover, although it leaves us weakened in facing situations of danger, anxiety also holds the key to our responses to that danger. This is what Rainsma wants to show, I think, with his mini-morality. Of course, the danger anxiety poses lies in its potential intensity and our tendency to flail about in search of appeasement. That is why we must abide with it, take some distance to irony or thought. Finally, because it's both personal and social to the point where Auden could speak of a veritable age of anxiety, anxiety's pathological variants raise the question of where abnormal affects part company from normal ones. But beyond social suffering and pathology, anxiety belongs to our pre-reflective awareness, our affective understanding, lacking determinate objects, of our connection to other people and their significance in our lives. Thank you.
As I suggested, we'll have Bettina will treat us to a wonderful feast of ideas and as they impinge on our existential emotional lives. Unless you're anxious to ask some questions, we'll have an opportunity of a wine and cheese to continue the discussion of Bettina. But anyone has an anxious question that you can't wait to address or pose the question, we have an opportunity for 2 or 3 questions or remarks.
It's a simple question, really. I guess I'm curious as to because we didn't hear the intermediary part that connects with the Levinas.
Right.
So you end with the suggestion that there's a kind of telos in Levinas, that he provides us some kind of fundamental position about the function of anxiety.
Yeah.
But because your method is historical, I guess I wonder how are we, what's the rationale for the positioning of Levinas otherwise than that it gives us a function, right?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is so unwieldy. The reason I didn't want to have a chapter on Husserl, because Husserl is the driest philosopher, describing the essences of triangles and stuff like that. But Husserl has a moment where he's talking about things that start to come together passively. Even we don't even see this happening, so he starts to develop an unconscious. And for me, this is what gives rise to Levinas's specific brand of phenomenology. He takes phenomenology and just breaks all the formalism, running the risk of psychologizing it, to show the intersubjective dimension that Husserl developed, but dryly and formally. So the second half of the book is Husserl, Heidegger's betrayal of Husserl, his hermeneutic term. And finally, how Levinas comes back to Husserl and uses the work on substance.
Another question? The French say that a gourmand meal always leaves you with an appetite for more. So we look forward to further encounters and dialogue with you. And we'll have a bit now with cheese and wine. So once again, thank you very much.